is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now.
For years, royal insiders believed every secret Queen Elizabeth wished to leave behind had already been buried within the palace archives. But everything changed when an overlooked letter, sealed under extraordinary instructions, suddenly resurfaced. What began as an ordinary review of royal documents quickly turned into a moment so devastating that King Charles reportedly struggled to remain standing. And as whispers spread through the corridors of power, one terrifying question emerged: what exactly had the late Queen written? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The discovery itself was almost impossible to believe. Deep within a collection of carefully preserved royal records, a single document emerged from obscurity, hidden among papers that had long been considered routine and unremarkable. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. The envelope carried no dramatic markings, no obvious indication that it contained anything capable of shaking the foundations of the monarchy. Yet those who handled it immediately noticed one detail that sent a chill through everyone involved. Attached to the letter were highly unusual instructions written years earlier under the authority of Queen Elizabeth herself. The instructions were clear. The letter was not to be opened immediately after her passing. It was not to be reviewed by advisors, historians, or senior officials. Instead, it was to remain sealed until a specific set of circumstances had been met. Even more startling was the fact that only a handful of trusted individuals appeared to know of its existence. For years, the document sat untouched, almost forgotten, waiting silently while events unfolded exactly as the Queen had seemingly anticipated. When the discovery was reported to senior palace officials, the reaction was immediate. Conversations that normally remained calm and measured suddenly became urgent. Calls were made behind closed doors. Trusted aides were summoned. The atmosphere quickly shifted from curiosity to concern. Nobody knew precisely what the letter contained, but everyone understood one thing: Queen Elizabeth never acted without purpose. If she had gone to such extraordinary lengths to conceal this message, there had to be a reason. King Charles was quietly informed. At first, he reportedly assumed the letter was nothing more than a personal message from his mother, perhaps a final reflection or private remembrance intended for him alone. After all, the years following her passing had been filled with moments of remembrance and reflection. Receiving another message from her, however unexpected, hardly seemed alarming. Yet the expressions on the faces of those presenting the letter suggested something very different. This was not being treated as a sentimental keepsake. It was being treated as something far more significant. As the envelope was placed before him, Charles reportedly felt a mixture of emotions that few people could truly understand. Beyond the crown, beyond the responsibilities of monarchy, stood a son confronting the possibility of hearing his mother's voice one final time. The weight of that moment alone would have been enough to overwhelm anyone. But there was something else lingering beneath the surface, a growing sense of unease, a feeling that this message had been preserved not merely to comfort him, but to warn him. The longer the letter remained unopened, the heavier the tension became. Senior aides encouraged him to read it immediately. Their urgency was unusual. Their concern was unmistakable. Some appeared nervous. Others seemed reluctant to even discuss the matter. Every reaction only deepened the mystery. Why had Queen Elizabeth wanted this message hidden for so long? What could possibly be inside that required such secrecy? And why did those closest to the situation seem so fearful of what might be revealed? As Charles prepared himself to finally uncover the contents, troubling possibilities began to form. Perhaps the Queen had left guidance regarding the future of the monarchy. Perhaps she had documented concerns she never shared publicly. Or perhaps the letter contained something even more explosive, a hidden truth capable of reopening old wounds, exposing buried tensions, and forcing the royal family to confront realities they had spent years trying to avoid. Whatever the answer was, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This was not an ordinary piece of correspondence. This was a message carefully preserved across time, waiting for exactly the right moment to surface. And as the silence around the unopened letter grew heavier, nobody could have imagined how dramatically the next few moments would alter everything they thought they knew, because hidden inside those sealed pages was the beginning of a revelation that would soon send shockwaves through the palace itself. But the moment Charles broke the seal, the carefully controlled world around him began to unravel. As Charles unfolded the letter, he expected comfort, wisdom, perhaps even a final expression of maternal love. Instead, the first few lines reportedly left him frozen. The Queen's words carried an urgency that felt impossible, as though she had foreseen a danger looming over the monarchy long after her passing. And with every sentence, Charles found himself confronting truths he never expected to hear from the woman who had ruled for generations. The room around him seemed to disappear, as his eyes settled on the familiar handwriting. For a brief moment, the years between them vanished. He was no longer simply a king burdened by the weight of the crown. He was a son hearing his mother's voice once more. That alone carried an emotional force capable of shaking even the strongest resolve. Yet almost immediately, something felt wrong. The tone was unlike anything he had anticipated. There were no comforting reflections, no gentle reassurances about the future. Instead, the opening lines carried a seriousness that demanded his full attention. According to those who later learned fragments of the encounter, Queen Elizabeth began the letter with a statement that immediately set the tone for everything that followed. She reportedly acknowledged that certain concerns had remained unspoken during her lifetime, not because they lacked importance, but because the timing had never been right. Those words alone were enough to unsettle Charles. Throughout her reign, the late Queen had been known for discipline, caution, and extraordinary restraint. If she had deliberately withheld concerns of such significance, then whatever followed could not be dismissed as routine reflection. As Charles continued reading, the message appeared to move beyond personal matters and into territory far more troubling. The Queen allegedly described changes she had quietly observed during her final years, changes that worried her deeply. She wrote about pressures building beneath the surface of royal life, tensions that appeared manageable from the outside, yet were growing steadily more dangerous behind closed doors. The letter suggested that threats to the monarchy were not always obvious. Some emerged from public criticism, others came from internal divisions, and the most dangerous of all were the ones people refused to acknowledge until it was too late. The deeper he read, the heavier the burden became. This was no longer a mother's farewell. It was beginning to resemble a warning. The Queen's words reportedly carried a sense of urgency that bordered on alarm. She appeared convinced that a difficult period lay ahead, one that could challenge not only individual members of the family, but the very stability of the institution itself. Charles found himself rereading certain passages, searching for alternative meanings, hoping he had misunderstood. But each time he returned to the words, the message remained unchanged. What disturbed him most was how personal the warning became. At several points, the Queen reportedly addressed him not as a monarch, but as her son. She spoke of responsibility, sacrifice, and the loneliness that accompanies leadership. More importantly, she hinted that difficult choices would soon confront him, choices that could not be avoided and would carry consequences far beyond his own reign. It was as though she had anticipated battles that had not yet fully emerged, leaving him guidance for storms she believed were still approaching. Outside the room, subtle signs began attracting attention. Staff members who briefly interacted with Charles noticed unusual changes in his demeanor. Conversations were cut short. Scheduled discussions were delayed. The king's normally measured composure appeared strained. Nobody knew what the letter contained, but it was becoming increasingly obvious that its contents were affecting him profoundly. Concern quietly spread among those closest to him, while speculation grew with every passing hour. Yet, for all the anxiety building around the message, Charles had still not reached the section that Queen Elizabeth seemed most determined for him to see. The earlier warnings were troubling enough, but they were merely laying the foundation for something much larger. Hidden deeper within the letter, was a revelation that would force him to confront questions he had never imagined asking. And as he turned the next page, the atmosphere of concern that had surrounded the letter suddenly became something far more dangerous. Then came the paragraph that transformed concern into complete shock. Buried deep within the letter was a revelation so unexpected that even the most seasoned royal advisors would later struggle to process its implications. It wasn't simply a warning, it was a confession. A secret Queen Elizabeth had allegedly carried for decades, hidden beneath ceremonies, traditions, and public duty. And now, years after her passing, that secret was landing directly in Charles's hands. Until this point, the letter had been unsettling, even alarming. It spoke of challenges, divisions, and dangers that threatened the monarchy's future. But as Charles continued reading, the tone shifted dramatically. The warnings gave way to something far more personal. The Queen was no longer discussing what might happen. She was finally revealing something that already had. Something she had carried silently through years of public service, private sacrifice, and relentless responsibility. The words on the page reportedly became heavier with every line, as though each sentence had been waiting decades to be written. According to those familiar with fragments of the story, Queen Elizabeth described what she called a burden of duty that had followed her throughout much of her reign. It was not a burden created by public criticism or political pressure. It was something much closer to home, a private truth that demanded silence, even when silence became painful. A reality she believed could never be fully explained while she was alive. For decades, she had protected the institution above all else, placing stability ahead of personal comfort. Yet now, with time no longer standing in her way, she appeared determined to leave Charles with the truth she could never publicly acknowledge. The revelation reportedly challenged assumptions that had guided parts of royal life for years. Long-accepted decisions suddenly appeared in a different light. Actions that once seemed straightforward now carried hidden layers of meaning. Charles found himself revisiting memories he thought he understood. Conversations from the past resurfaced. Difficult choices made by family members took on entirely new significance. The more he read, the more he realized that events he had once viewed separately might have been connected all along by a thread he had never seen. What made the confession even more devastating was its isolation. The Queen appeared to make it clear that almost nobody else knew the full truth. Senior advisors had not been told. Trusted officials remained unaware. Even those closest to the monarchy had apparently never been given access to this hidden chapter. The secret existed in a space entirely its own, protected by silence and carried by a woman who understood the cost of revealing it. Now that responsibility was passing to Charles alone. As the implications settled over him, an intense conflict began to emerge. He was not merely reading a private confession from his mother. He was confronting information that could influence the future of the crown itself. The divide between family loyalty and royal duty suddenly became impossible to ignore. One path demanded protection, the other demanded honesty, yet both carried consequences capable of reshaping relationships that had already endured years of strain and uncertainty. For perhaps the first time since opening the envelope, Charles reportedly stopped reading altogether. The weight of what he had learned forced him to pause. Questions flooded his mind faster than answers could arrive. Had previous royal decisions been influenced by this hidden truth? Had certain conflicts unfolded because people lacked knowledge that only the Queen possessed? And most troubling of all, what would happen if the secret ever became known beyond the pages of the letter? The monarchy had spent generations presenting certainty, continuity, and strength. Yet in this moment, certainty was vanishing. The foundations that once felt unshakable now appeared vulnerable. A single confession from the late Queen had introduced doubt where confidence once existed. It had transformed a private message into something far larger, a revelation with the power to alter how the past was understood and how the future might unfold. But even as Charles struggled to absorb the truth, the Queen's confession was leading somewhere even more painful. Because hidden among the final lines of this extraordinary revelation was a warning about who would ultimately bear the consequences. And as Charles turned to the next part of the letter, he discovered that the secret itself was only half the story. Yet the most painful part wasn't the secret itself, it was who the Queen believed would be affected by it. The deeper Charles read, the more it became clear that this was not merely a reflection on the past. The Queen had identified individuals she believed would shape the monarchy's fate in ways no one could predict. Some names brought comfort, others reopened wounds that had never truly healed. And one particular mention reportedly left Charles staring at the page in disbelief. The confession had already shaken him. The hidden burden his mother described had forced him to reconsider years of royal history through an entirely different lens. Yet as he continued through the letter, Queen Elizabeth's focus began to shift. She was no longer speaking only about secrets, regrets, or difficult choices. She was speaking about people, specific individuals whose actions, decisions, and relationships would influence the future long after she was gone. And with each carefully chosen sentence, Charles reportedly felt the emotional weight of those observations settling heavily upon him. Some references appeared gentle, almost reassuring. The Queen spoke of resilience, loyalty, and sacrifice. She acknowledged those who had quietly carried responsibilities without demanding recognition. Reading those passages reportedly brought moments of reflection for Charles. He recognized the individuals his mother was describing, even when names were not explicitly written. The observations felt deeply personal, revealing just how carefully she had studied the family around her, not only as a monarch but as a mother and grandmother. But those moments of comfort did not last. Gradually, the tone darkened. The Queen began addressing fractures that had developed over the years. Old disagreements, lingering resentments, relationships damaged by misunderstandings, pride, and competing visions of duty. The letter did not assign simple blame. Instead, it painted a picture of a family struggling under extraordinary pressure, where private pain often hid behind public appearances. For Charles, those passages were impossible to read without revisiting memories he had spent years trying to leave behind. Each paragraph seemed to unlock another chapter of the past. Conversations he remembered vividly suddenly returned. Moments of tension that once appeared isolated now seemed connected. The Queen's words suggested that some of the monarchy's greatest challenges had never truly been about protocol, succession, or public image. They had been about trust. Trust lost, trust tested, and trust that in some cases had never been fully restored. What disturbed Charles most was the realization that his mother had seen these dangers long before anyone else acknowledged them. She had observed patterns emerging beneath the surface. She had anticipated divisions widening. She had quietly recognized conflicts that would continue shaping the family for years to come. Reading her observations now felt almost prophetic. Events that once seemed unpredictable suddenly appeared as developments she had been preparing for all along. Then came the section that reportedly stopped him cold. Amid the various references and reflections, one individual emerged as the central focus of the Queen's concern. The mention was neither angry nor critical. If anything, it carried a profound sense of worry. Yet its significance was unmistakable. Charles reportedly read the passage several times, struggling to process what his mother was implying. Why had she singled out this person? What had she seen that others had missed? And why did she seem convinced that this individual would play such a crucial role in the monarchy's future? The questions multiplied faster than answers could emerge. If the Queen's assessment was correct, then major assumptions about the years ahead might already be flawed. Decisions being made in the present could carry consequences nobody fully understood. The secret confession had already challenged Charles's understanding of the past. Now these personal observations were forcing him to question the future as well. An uncomfortable fear began taking hold. Perhaps the greatest threat to the monarchy would not come from outside forces. Perhaps it would emerge from unresolved tensions within the family itself. The Queen seemed determined to make him understand that leadership alone could not prevent conflict. Difficult choices were approaching, and the people closest to the crown would inevitably be caught in their path. By now, the emotional strain was becoming overwhelming. The letter had transformed from a private message into something resembling a roadmap of coming storms. Every page carried new warnings, deeper concerns, and increasingly personal revelations. Yet, despite everything he had already learned, the Queen was still holding back her most devastating disclosure. By this point, the king's emotions were spiraling, but the final pages would push him beyond anything he expected. Witnesses would later struggle to describe exactly what happened next. One moment, Charles was reading quietly. The next, the weight of decades, regrets, family divisions, and unanswered questions appeared to crash down upon him all at once. Whatever he discovered in the final pages proved too much to absorb in a single moment, triggering a scene that left palace insiders stunned. By the time Charles reached the final section of the letter, he was no longer reading as a king evaluating a historical document. He was reading as a son confronting the last hidden truths of a mother who had spent an entire lifetime carrying responsibilities few could truly understand. Every page before this point had peeled back another layer of certainty. Long-held assumptions had been challenged. Old wounds had been reopened. The future itself had begun to feel less secure. Yet nothing prepared him for what waited in the closing pages. The Queen's final revelation reportedly abandoned all caution. The carefully measured language that defined much of the letter suddenly became direct, urgent, and intensely personal. It was as though she understood that time had finally run out. Whatever she had been protecting for decades, whatever burden she had carried in silence, she now placed entirely before Charles. There would be no further opportunities, no additional explanations, no second letter waiting somewhere else. This was the complete truth as she believed he needed to know it. According to accounts that later circulated among trusted insiders, the final disclosure connected everything that had come before. The hidden burden, the warnings about future conflict, the concerns regarding specific family members, the fears surrounding the monarchy's stability. Suddenly, they were no longer separate pieces of a puzzle. They formed a single picture, one far more troubling than Charles had imagined when he first opened the envelope. The realization reportedly struck him with extraordinary force. For years, he had lived within a framework built upon certainty. He understood the family's history. He understood the decisions that had shaped the crown. He understood the sacrifices required to preserve continuity, or at least he believed he did. But now, in a matter of moments, the foundation beneath those beliefs appeared to shift. The Queen's final words suggested that some of the most important events in royal life had been influenced by truths hidden from almost everyone. The implications stretched far beyond the past. They reached directly into the future. Charles reportedly stopped reading. The silence that followed became unsettling. Minutes passed. The letter remained open before him. Those nearby sensed something was wrong long before they understood its cause. The emotional strain that had been building throughout the reading process finally reached its breaking point. Decades of pressure, family conflict, responsibility, grief, and unanswered questions seemed to converge at once. The burden was no longer intellectual. It was deeply personal. Then came the moment nobody expected. Staff members reportedly rushed forward as Charles suddenly appeared overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had learned. Concerns spread immediately. Calls were made. Security personnel were alerted. Medical assistance was requested without delay. What had begun as the reading of a private letter was rapidly becoming a palace emergency. As doctors hurried to assess the situation, another concern emerged just as quickly: the letter itself. Senior aides understood that whatever message had produced such a dramatic reaction could not simply be left unattended. The document was quietly secured. Access was restricted. Discussions became increasingly urgent. Questions multiplied throughout the corridors of power. What had the Queen revealed? What information could possibly have affected Charles so profoundly? And perhaps most importantly, who else knew about it? Rumors spread despite every effort to contain them. Staff noticed unusual activity. Meetings were interrupted. Schedules changed. trusted officials exchanged worried conversations behind closed doors. The absence of clear answers only fueled growing speculation. Some believed the letter contained a warning about the future of the monarchy. Others suspected a deeply personal family revelation. A few feared it was something even larger. What nobody realized was that the crisis unfolding around the king's health was only the beginning. Because while doctors focused on Charles and aides focused on protecting the letter, a separate struggle was already taking shape. The Queen's final message had created more than shock. It had created a dangerous dilemma. Decisions would soon have to be made about what happened next, who could be trusted, and whether the truth should ever leave the pages where it had remained hidden for so many years. As doctors attended to the king, another battle was already beginning behind closed doors. News of the king's collapse was never supposed to leave the room. Yet royal secrets have a way of escaping even the strongest walls. Within hours, rumors began circulating among staff, advisors, and trusted insiders. The palace suddenly found itself facing two emergencies at once: protecting the king's health and preventing the contents of Elizabeth's final message from igniting a crisis. As concern for Charles spread through the palace, an atmosphere of urgency settled over every level of the institution. What had begun as a private encounter between a king and a letter from his late mother was rapidly transforming into something far more dangerous. The immediate priority was obvious. Doctors needed to ensure Charles recovered from the emotional and physical strain that had overwhelmed him. But behind that immediate concern lurked another problem that many senior officials considered equally serious. The letter itself had become a potential threat to stability. Within minutes of the emergency response, strict measures were reportedly put into place. Access to the document was heavily restricted. Only a select group of trusted individuals were permitted to know where it had been secured. Conversations regarding its contents became tightly controlled. Every precaution reflected the same fear. If the Queen's final revelations became public before palace leadership understood their full implications, the consequences could be impossible to contain. Yet containment was proving difficult. Royal institutions have always relied on discipline, discretion, and carefully managed communication. But uncertainty has a way of creating its own momentum. Staff members noticed unusual activity. Senior aides moved quickly between meetings. Scheduled engagements were quietly adjusted. The changes were subtle, but they were impossible to ignore. Before long, questions began spreading throughout trusted circles. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, but everyone understood that something extraordinary had taken place. Rumors multiplied with remarkable speed. Some claimed the letter contained information about long-hidden family conflicts. Others whispered that Queen Elizabeth had left behind a warning capable of altering the monarchy's future. Each new theory fueled another. The absence of confirmed facts only made the speculation more intense. In an institution built upon continuity and certainty, uncertainty itself was becoming a source of instability. Behind closed doors, senior advisors faced difficult decisions. Some argued that absolute secrecy remained essential. They believed the letter should remain protected until Charles personally decided what actions, if any, should follow. Others worried that delaying too long could create even greater problems. If fragments of the story leaked without context, public imagination could prove far more damaging than the truth itself. The debate quickly evolved into something larger than document security. It became a struggle over how the monarchy should respond to a crisis nobody had anticipated. As those discussions continued, another uncomfortable topic began quietly entering conversations. No one spoke about it openly. No one wanted to acknowledge it directly. Yet the king's sudden collapse had forced certain realities into view. Questions about leadership, continuity, and succession lingered in the background. Officials understood that the monarchy's strength depended upon public confidence. Any perception of instability could have consequences extending far beyond the palace walls. The pressure intensified for senior royals as well. Those closest to the institution found themselves navigating a landscape filled with uncertainty. Some sought answers, others sought reassurance. A few feared that whatever Queen Elizabeth had revealed might trigger consequences, reaching every branch of the family. The secret that had shaken Charles was no longer affecting only one man. Its shadow was beginning to stretch across the entire monarchy. Meanwhile, speculation outside official circles continued to grow. Every unexplained change, every delayed appearance, every whispered conversation seemed to generate new theories. The palace worked tirelessly to maintain order, but beneath the surface, tension continued building. The Queen's final message had already disrupted the present. The question now was whether it would also reshape the future. What made the situation even more complicated was the growing realization that the letter had not ended with warnings, confessions, or revelations. Hidden within its closing pages was something else entirely, something the Queen had deliberately preserved until the exact moment she believed it would matter most. While advisors focused on damage control and officials struggled to contain speculation, another part of her message was quietly waiting to emerge. But while officials focused on controlling the present, the Queen's final request was preparing to reshape the future. Near the end of the letter, Queen Elizabeth reportedly included one final request, a request she trusted only Charles to fulfill. It wasn't about titles, ceremonies, or public appearances. It was something far more personal and far more dangerous. Fulfilling it could unite the family. Ignoring it could fracture the monarchy forever. And suddenly, Charles faced the most difficult choice of his reign. As concern continued spreading throughout the palace, attention slowly returned to the letter itself. The warnings had been unsettling. The confession had been devastating. The revelations about the future had shaken long-standing assumptions. Yet according to those who later pieced together fragments of the story, Queen Elizabeth had saved perhaps her most important message for the very end. It was not a command. It was not an instruction issued by a monarch. It was a request from a mother who understood that time had run out and that her son would soon stand alone before decisions capable of shaping generations. The wording reportedly carried a completely different tone from everything that came before it. The urgency remained, but it was softened by something deeply personal. For the first time in the letter, the distance between sovereign and successor seemed to disappear entirely. Queen Elizabeth was no longer speaking from the position of a ruler protecting an institution. She was speaking as a parent placing her final hope in the hands of her child. The request itself was extraordinary because it extended far beyond Charles. It involved relationships that had been tested by years of conflict, misunderstanding, and emotional wounds. The Queen appeared convinced that unresolved divisions posed a greater threat to the monarchy than any external challenge. She understood that public controversies eventually faded, political storms eventually passed, and criticism eventually changed direction. Family fractures were different. They lingered, they deepened, and if ignored long enough, they could become impossible to repair. As Charles reflected on her words, the full weight of responsibility settled over him once again. The request was simple in principle but overwhelming in practice. It demanded courage, patience, and sacrifice. More importantly, it required him to make choices that could upset powerful individuals while potentially disappointing others. There was no path that guaranteed success. Every option carried risks. Every possible outcome seemed capable of creating new tensions, even as it attempted to heal old ones. That realization intensified the conflict already raging within him. Part of Charles wanted to honor the wishes of the woman whose dedication had defined an era. The emotional bond between mother and son made that instinct almost impossible to resist. Yet another part of him understood the practical realities of royal life. Decisions affecting the family rarely remained private. Personal actions often carried institutional consequences. The Queen's request was not simply asking him to address the past, it was asking him to gamble with the future. Senior advisors reportedly shared many of those concerns once they learned portions of the situation. While some believed the request deserved serious consideration, others urged caution. They worried that acting too quickly could create instability at a moment when the monarchy was already facing uncertainty. The king's health concerns, the secrecy surrounding the letter, and the growing speculation among insiders had created a fragile environment. Any major decision could trigger consequences nobody fully understood. Yet despite the warnings, Charles could not ignore what the request represented. It was the final expression of trust from a woman who had spent decades carrying responsibilities that few could comprehend. The Queen had deliberately chosen him, and him alone, to determine whether her hope would survive beyond her lifetime. That knowledge transformed the request into something far more significant than a simple family matter. It became a defining test of leadership, loyalty, and character. The stakes continued to grow with every passing hour. If Charles honored the request, he could potentially alter the trajectory of the royal family for years to come. If he rejected it, he risked allowing old divisions to harden into permanent fractures. The choice stood before him like a crossroads from which there would be no easy return. But even as he wrestled with that impossible decision, there was one final part of the letter he had not fully absorbed. A single sentence remained. Short, direct, unforgettable. And according to those closest to the unfolding crisis, its meaning would haunt everyone who encountered it. Yet even that request was overshadowed by the chilling final sentence written at the bottom of the page. Long after the collapse, long after the emergency meetings, and long after the palace attempted to restore calm, one sentence continued haunting everyone connected to the letter. It was the final line Queen Elizabeth chose to leave behind. Simple, direct, unforgettable. And according to those closest to the situation, those words may ultimately become the most consequential message ever delivered to King Charles. For all the attention focused on the warnings, the hidden confession, and the Queen's extraordinary final request, it was the last sentence that refused to fade. Those who became aware of its existence described it not as a dramatic declaration or a royal instruction, but as something far more powerful. It carried the weight of a lifetime. Every sacrifice Queen Elizabeth had made, every burden she had endured, and every lesson she had learned seemed to be condensed into a single final thought. The sentence was brief, yet its meaning appeared almost limitless. In the days that followed, Charles reportedly found himself returning to those words again and again. They lingered in his thoughts during private moments and followed him into discussions about the future. Unlike the earlier sections of the letter, which contained explanations and revelations, the final sentence offered no detailed guidance. Instead, it posed a challenge. It forced him to confront the central question that had quietly existed beneath every page of the document. What mattered more, preserving comfort in the present or protecting the future at any cost? The deeper he reflected, the more he began viewing the letter not as a collection of separate messages, but as a complete portrait of his mother's legacy. Queen Elizabeth had spent decades navigating crises, family tensions, public scrutiny, and institutional change. Through it all, she remained committed to something larger than herself. The final sentence appeared to reveal what she ultimately believed mattered most after a lifetime of service. It was not power. It was not status. It was not even tradition alone. It was responsibility. That realization shifted everything. The letter's focus increasingly moved away from hidden secrets and toward the people who would inherit the consequences of today's decisions. Family relationships suddenly became impossible to separate from the future of the crown. Old disputes, unresolved grievances, and lingering mistrust no longer seemed like private matters. They appeared connected to the long-term stability of the monarchy itself. The Queen's final message seemed to suggest that the greatest challenge facing future generations would not be external opposition. It would be whether the family could find a path forward together. Yet understanding the message and acting upon it were two very different things. Charles now faced a dilemma unlike any he had encountered before. The letter had provided insight, but it had not removed uncertainty. Every possible course of action carried risk. If he honored the spirit of his mother's wishes, difficult conversations and painful decisions would likely follow. If he chose caution and preserved the status quo, he risked ignoring the final advice of the woman who understood the monarchy better than anyone else. The emotional fallout continued spreading quietly through royal circles. Trusted advisors sensed that something significant had changed. Senior figures understood that the king's perspective was evolving. Although the contents of the letter remained hidden, its impact was becoming increasingly visible. Decisions once viewed through a political lens were now being weighed against something much more personal: the legacy of Queen Elizabeth herself. As Charles wrestled with these questions, another possibility began emerging. Perhaps the hidden meaning behind the final sentence was not a warning at all. Perhaps it was a test, a final measure of whether he would have the courage to make choices based on conviction rather than convenience. The Queen appeared to understand that leadership often demanded sacrifice, especially when the path forward threatened to create discomfort in the present. The future of the monarchy now seemed suspended between two competing forces: legacy and duty, memory and responsibility, family and institution. Every revelation contained within the letter ultimately pointed toward that same crossroads. And while no immediate decision had yet been announced, it was becoming increasingly clear that Charles could not remain at the intersection forever. Because the final sentence had accomplished exactly what Queen Elizabeth intended, it had transformed a hidden letter into a question that would continue echoing through the monarchy long after the pages were put away. And as the monarchy entered an uncertain new chapter, one question remained impossible to ignore. The collapse itself may have lasted only moments, but its consequences threatened to echo for generations. The Queen's letter had exposed fears, regrets, warnings, and hopes buried beneath decades of royal tradition. Now the burden rested entirely on Charles. Whether he followed his mother's final wishes or chose another path would determine not only his legacy, but the future of the crown itself. In the weeks that followed, the immediate crisis gradually faded from public view, but the deeper questions raised by the letter refused to disappear. The document had done something few events in modern royal history had ever accomplished. It had forced the monarchy to look inward. Beneath the ceremonies, the traditions, and the carefully maintained image of continuity lay a family confronting difficult truths about its past and uncertain choices about its future. The collapse that shocked palace insiders was no longer the central story. The real story had become what happened next. For Charles, the experience reportedly marked a turning point. The man who first opened the letter, expecting a private message from his late mother, was not the same man left contemplating its final words. Every revelation, every warning, and every request had reshaped his perspective. The Queen had entrusted him with more than information. She had entrusted him with responsibility, and that responsibility carried consequences reaching far beyond his own reign. Around him, reactions continued to unfold in different ways. Some family members reportedly sensed that important discussions were taking place behind closed doors. Others found themselves reflecting on relationships that had grown strained over time. The letter's contents remained hidden, yet its influence quietly touched everyone connected to the institution. Old disagreements suddenly seemed more significant. Long-standing assumptions became less certain. Questions once ignored could no longer be easily dismissed. Beyond palace walls, uncertainty continued to grow. Rumors persisted, speculation flourished. Every public appearance, every decision, and every unexpected development generated fresh theories about what might have been contained within Queen Elizabeth's final message. While the truth remained protected, the mystery surrounding it only deepened. The absence of answers created a story of its own, one that continued capturing attention long after the initial shock had passed. At the center of everything stood the legacy of Queen Elizabeth herself. Throughout her reign, she had been defined by patience, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to duty. Yet this final letter revealed another side of her legacy. It revealed a woman deeply concerned about the future, determined to leave behind guidance even after her voice could no longer be heard directly. Whether viewed as a warning, a confession, or a final act of leadership, the letter ensured that her influence would continue shaping events long after her passing. The future now appeared filled with possibilities and uncertainty in equal measure. Questions about leadership, unity, and the direction of the monarchy remained unresolved. Charles faced decisions that could alter relationships, redefine priorities, and potentially change the course of royal history. The answers were not yet visible. The path forward remained unclear. And perhaps that was exactly what made the story so compelling. Because despite everything that had happened, despite the emotional revelations and extraordinary consequences, the letter had not provided a neat conclusion. Instead, it left behind a challenge. A challenge that would continue following Charles as he weighed loyalty against duty, tradition against change, and personal conviction against institutional responsibility. The mystery remains unfinished, the final choice remains unknown, and somewhere ahead, a decision still waits to be made. Because somewhere within the palace walls, the letter still exists, and so does the secret that brought a king to his knees. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.